Vice President Kamala Harris has just proposed an economic plan to put a federal ban on price gouging. That would essentially mean putting a price cap on certain things, possibly rent or food or things like that. This is what economists call price controls, and they have a really interesting history, a very long history, in fact. Price controls have been used for more than 1,000 years in ancient Egypt and all over the world. Economists, though, generally do not like price controls, and here's why. So prices tend to be the point where supply and demand meet, right? So if there's a ton of something and there's not much demand for it, the price goes down. If there's huge demand for something and not very many of them, the price goes up. This is this balance that creates price of supply and demand. And economists say when you mess with that, all kinds of really bad things can happen, even if the intentions are really good. But probably the most sweeping example of price controls in US history goes back to the 40s, to 1942, under President FDR. This was during World War II. This was also the Great Depression. People were in dire straits, having a terrible time affording very basic things like food. So many people were living in their cars, driving across the country, trying to find a place where they could make a living. Another thing that was happening was inflation. Inflation was around 10% at this time. So in all of this turmoil, prices were rising by quite a bit. FDR created the Office Price Administration. This was intended to sort of track and monitor prices across the country and make sure that companies and stores were not gouging people who couldn't really afford a lot of really basic things. He took it a step further in 1942 and created something called the Emergency Price Control Act of 1942.
You do not have to be a professor of mathematics or economics to see that if people with plenty of cash start bidding against each other for scarce goods, the price of those goods goes up. Yesterday, I submitted to the Congress of the United States a 7-point program for attaining the great objective of keeping the cost of living down. First, we must, through heavier taxes, keep personal and corporate profits at a low, reasonable rate. Second, we must fix ceilings on prices and rents.
The first problem that came up was policing it. I mean, if you tell every company, every business all across the country that they have to keep their prices the same, that they can't raise prices, you have to police that and there have to be consequences. So the government at the time hired 60,000 workers to sort of spread out across the economy and track these things. There were also 100,000 additional volunteers. I mean, this was just a mammoth undertaking. The second thing that happened were shortages and rationing. So this makes sense with supply and demand, right? Because the supply stayed the same, but demand went way up because prices were not in there. Usually what happens is if demand is really high for something, the price goes up until demand drops off. But in this case, prices couldn't go up. So things like rationing had to be put in place. So like lines for bread and lines for meat, and only, families could get only a certain amount of meat, but at least there was meat to be had for people. There were, though, huge lines for bread, huge lines for sugar, huge lines for meat, things like that. The other issue this created, of course, was cheating. Companies trying to find every possible way around this, including adding lots of filler to things, things like hot dogs or meat products would have lots of bread stuffed in there. Kind of the same sort of shrinkflation, skimpflation, shout out to Greg Rosalsky for that one, that we have been seeing. And the big one was the black market. So it created this kind of double economy because people who could afford to buy meat, some of the more fortunate people in the economy, found ways around the rations. And of course, where there is demand, often supply will come and meet it. And of course, what Vice President Harris is suggesting is a much scaled down version. This is not a cautionary tale or anything like that. But for me, what I think it shows is there are always trade-offs to every policy, the good ones, the bad ones. And I really think it's important to understand and talk about those trade-offs.